and I know we'll be joined by other members who are still leaving the House floor. I'd like to extend a welcome to this afternoon's hearing, which will take stock of China's Maritime Silk Road Initiative and its implications for the United States maritime industry and military readiness. This hearing comes at a critical moment in our relationship with the People's Republic of China. Where we once found a willing international partner, or thought we did, we now face an increasingly aggressive and confrontational adversary. Just last week, in fact, I and my bipartisan, bicameral congressional delegation from a different committee were denied visas to visit the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. This unprecedented step of barring a United States congressional delegation from the country occurred for one reason only: our planned visit to Taiwan. Chinese officials stated clearly that if we canceled our visit to Taiwan, the visas would be issued. When we made clear that canceling the delegation stop in Taiwan was not an option, the officials demanded that I issue a statement endorsing Beijing's version of the One China policy, delegitimizing Taiwan's political existence and further isolating the island's 24 million people. I declined. This incident is emblematic of the challenges the United States and private businesses and industries, such as the NBA, the Apple Corporation, Hollywood studios, now face in confronting China's bullying and intimidation tactics, which grow out of China's regional and global ambitions. Moreover, as a nation, we find ourselves at a fork in the road as to the best course to ensure American access to efficient, reliable, and secure global maritime commerce in this new geopolitical context. The Maritime Silk Road Initiative is one component of an expansive foreign policy promoted by China, referred to as the Belton Road Initiative. This overarching strategy intends to reshape the global economic and security landscape and seascape through Chinese investments in global infrastructure, including maritime infrastructure. Command of the maritime transportation system has long acted as the stage on which great powers compete. Now, globally, over 90% of commercial goods travel by sea, and the competition is rightly intense. The infrastructure facilitating the transport of maritime commerce, ocean-going vessels, deep-water ports, high-speed railways, and fiber optic cables descend from technologies Western powers once leveraged in the 19th and 20th centuries to expand their access to foreign markets. Today, the Maritime Silk Road Initiative mimics these strategies, for example, by building railways and naval ports in Africa, or laying transatlantic data cables. In some locations, new MSR projects are literally replicating former colonial projects. The Maritime Silk Road, or MSR, initiative is a strategic economic policy and security initiative intended to promote the Chinese workforce, build bilateral ties, foster dependence, and ensure near-exclusive access to foreign ports for Chinese-controlled or affiliated vessels employing Chinese-built technologies, 5G just being the most obvious example. Through MSR projects, China can advance both economic and security objectives simultaneously. These projects act as, quote, dual-use infrastructure, developments that serve both commercial and military purposes. China deploys many different tools to cajole or coerce the cooperation of foreign states, including project finance tools like loan guarantees and conditions, or the control of source funds and debt service obligations. In addition, design and construction standards, technology transfer requirements, and intelligence acquisition through ownership and operation of infrastructure enable China to gain favorable access and control of the marine transportation system. The stakes are high. In an economically interconnected world, foreign-financed infrastructure investments can fuel both development and strategic competition. The MSR is a linchpin of China's dominance of international maritime trade and the development of trained labor to support its operations. China's investment in its national fleet has made China the most prolific shipbuilding nation to date, dramatically altering the dynamics of the global maritime trades. In fact, the 5 major Chinese carriers alone controlled 18% of the global volume of container shipping in 2015. At the same time, we in the United States have allowed our U.S. flag fleet in the foreign trades, our maritime workforce, and our domestic commercial shipbuilding capacity to erode to their lowest points since before the Second World War. As a result, we have critically undermined our military readiness and a secure sea lift capability. The prospect of being unable to mobilize, support, and supply our armed forces for a sustained conflict, whether in the Taiwan Strait, the Middle East, or anywhere else in the world, should concern every member of this body, and it is my experience this is an area of genuine bipartisan agreement and concern. The number of U.S. flagged vessels sailing into international trade has dwindled from 183 ships in 1992 to just 82 ships as of December 2017, while over 3,000 Chinese flagged vessels operate in the international trade today. In a world economy increasingly powered by maritime commerce and blue water presence, we cannot continue to allow the United States' deep water fleet to decay on our watch. This hearing will shed light on the degree to which the Maritime Silk Road Initiative might co-opt the global maritime transportation system for Chinese industrial, commercial, and security gains, disable the remnant U.S. international trading fleet by monopolizing the transport of U.S. commerce, and destabilize both the U.S. merchant marine and maritime supply chain. I'd now like to call on the ranking member, Mr. Gibbs, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Looney, and I also concur with you, and I'm sorry to hear the passing of former Coast Guard Maritime Transportation Subcommittee Chairman Elijah Cummings. As chairman, he shepherded through Congress in 2010 the Coast Guard Authorization Act, which made significant improvements to the Coast Guard's acquisition program and enhanced its maritime safety efforts. When the Coast Guard frustrated him, he would eloquently use the chairman's seat to ensure that no witnesses ever left the subcommittee unclear where he stood. As a member of the Committee on Oversight and Reform, I came to appreciate the passion he devoted to his chairmanship. I pray for his family, friends, and staff that they find peace and strength in his memory and legacy. China has developed an industrial policy to align with its foreign policy that has now expanded that policy outward through efforts to control the means of conducting international maritime trade, the same means used to project military force. China has developed an extensive shipbuilding industrial base and controls the third largest container line in the world. The Maritime Silk Road Initiative builds on those capabilities by financing port, road, and energy infrastructure in 126 countries in the Pacific Basin and routes to Europe. There are two concerns about these investments. First, the dual commercial and military uses of these assets. Second, the debt incurred by these countries will tie them to China in ways that will facilitate China's international pursuits and potentially inhibit U.S. overseas operations. The U.S. flag fleet has retreated from the world stage. Only a remnant remains which survives to provide sea lift capacity for the Department of Defense. However, for even that small fleet to be useful, it has to access to port facilities throughout the world. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today whether the access to such ports jeopardizes by China's efforts to extend its influence through the Maritime Silk Road Initiative. I'm also interested in China's efforts to gain a foothold in the Arctic. China has declared itself an Arctic adjacent country and has built 2 research icebreakers in the last decade. The United States, an actual Arctic nation, is only now beginning an icebreaker recapitalization program. In contrast to the Chinese Maritime Silk Road Initiative, after 5 years, neither of the last 2 administrations have managed to produce a legislatively mandated national maritime strategy. Perhaps today, hearing will prompt MORAD to meet the latest statutory deadline next February for this plan. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing today, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his remarks. I'd also like to ask unanimous consent at this time to insert statements from the United Steelworkers, the Association for American Manufacturing, and R Street into the hearing without objection. So ordered. This time I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly support your spirited remarks and observations at the beginning of the hearing, so I won't restate a number of those arguments or concerns. But before I make a brief statement, let me just say that my colleague of many years, Elijah Cummings, died last night, and you know, we put a little something here to remember him. I'll just tell one story. There are a lot of stories about Elijah, but the Coast Guard screwed up the 110s. They were going to section them and make them longer, and the design didn't work. And we were trying to get to the bottom of what went wrong, how it could have gone that badly wrong, because this was a very, very, very expensive mistake. And Elijah began a hearing at 10 o'clock in the morning with a number of panels of experts and witnesses in the Coast Guard, and a lot of participation by members during the day. Then it got to dinner time, and yeah, there's still more witnesses and a few people left here. And then by 11 o'clock at night, it was me and Elijah and Jim Overstar still sitting here. And by midnight, it was just Elijah. And I think shortly after midnight, the hearing adjourned. And that brought about very significant reforms in the acquisition process at the United States Coast Guard and with the icebreakers, new coordination with the Navy. So that was just one of many, many difficult issues he dealt with, drilled into, and resolved. And so he'll be greatly missed. So let me just say briefly, and I regret I can't stay because I think this is an extraordinarily important hearing for this committee. That I have, unfortunately, because of the delay of the votes and that, I've got commitments after this I can't avoid. But, U.S. has always been referred to as a great maritime nation. If you think back to Captain Alfred Mahar and his theories, which were backed up by Teddy Roosevelt, that we had to guarantee access to international markets as a maritime-dependent nation, and it required three things: a vibrant merchant fleet to carry American products to new markets, Great Highway of the High Seas, a battleship navy to deter or destroy rivals who might attack our maritime ships, and a network of naval bases abroad. But unfortunately, post-World War II, with globalization, liberalization, so-called, of trade, the rise of the IMO and the chase around the world to the least regulation and the cheapest possible, most abusable labor in the merchant marine industry, most of number one is gone, the vibrant merchant fleet. We still, number two, we do have the most powerful Navy, but the Chinese are building quickly to challenge that, and some of our naval assets, given new missile systems and others, may have become more vulnerable in the future, so not quite as big of a given. And then, China has essentially adopted the policy and theories of Teddy Roosevelt and Captain Mahar with their very own principle of sea power to construct its own maritime Silk Road. In addition to which they are, building bases or ports in diverse nations around the world, and they're doing it in ways that are truly despicable. I mean, not often the construction is substandard. Often it's done under an extortionate agreement to the host country, but it's always done to the advantage of China. Little notice has been taken of this. Their growing dominance as they aggregate, the merchant fleets to try and dominate our ports here. And we finally got some minor action in the last Congress on that, and some action out of MARAD, but more needs to be done there. So I think this is an incredibly important hearing. And, as Mahan once wrote, those who rule the waves rule the world. I don't think that's changed an awful lot these days, and we can't forget that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I'd like to now introduce our panel of witnesses. First, we are joined by Mr. Chad Sabragia. Do I have that correct? Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Lieutenant General Giovanni K. Tuck, Director for Logistics, J4 for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Ms. Carolyn Bartholomew, Chairwoman of the United States-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Thank you all for being here today. Apologize again for keeping you waiting. I know you're busy, but we appreciate it. We know you have prepared statements. I've reviewed those statements, and thank you. They're excellent. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. And since we have that written testimony and it's been made part of the record, we do request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes to allow maximum time for members' questions. With that, thank you again. Mr. Zabragia, you may proceed.
Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify. Before I begin, and to echo the comments already made, please allow me to express my condolences on the passing of Representative Cummings. We recognize his historic place in this chamber and his long-standing service, including in this subcommittee. Our thoughts and prayers are with his family at this time. As for the business in front of us today, China's Maritime Silk Road is exactly the type of issue in which we need to communicate across traditional lines of effort because of the unique challenge that China presents, echoing your comments. We welcome the chance to do so at this hearing. My remarks are going to focus on China's strategy and how the Department of Defense is supporting the whole-of-government competitive response. China's leaders certainly believe that they can and must contend for global leadership in a new era for socialism with Chinese characteristics, heralded most authoritatively at the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of China in October of 2017. In the maritime domain, this means building China into a maritime great power, which the Chinese Communist Party made an official national priority at its 18th Party Congress as early as 2012. In 2017, President Xi Jinping linked this maritime great power status to China's goals for national rejuvenation by 2049. Maritime great power status includes access to resources, a developed maritime economy, and protection of perceived maritime rights and interests. This is well served by China's One Belt, One Road and Maritime Silk Road initiatives, which focus on policy coordination and building transportation infrastructure globally to expand developmental ties to China. In this context, while we do not oppose China's contributions to high-quality development based on international standards, we must recognize that China is also competing for strategic advantage. While in the past, China's leaders have disavowed any direct connection between OBOR, or the One Belt, One Road, and the People's Liberation Army, or their security interest, there is clear evidence that this is changing. For example, China's 2019 National Defense White Paper identified the need to build China's far seas forces and a need for overseas logistical facilities. In January of this year, President Xi Jinping called for the completion of a security system for OBOR to ensure the security of major overseas projects. In July, China's defense minister openly declared that China is willing to deepen military exchanges and cooperation with Caribbean and Pacific Island countries under the framework of OBOR. Finally, as an example, the PLA Navy has recently argued for a long-term strategy to obtain bases overseas using methods such as constructing, purchasing, and long-term leasing of foreign ports. Lieutenant General Tuck will go into more detail on the military implications of China's activities, but I would like to quickly stress that OBOR projects could also increase other countries' exposures to coercive pressure and affect the security of digital infrastructure as well. Overlapping with China's Maritime Silk Road is the 21st Century Digital Silk Road, in which Chinese companies are building infrastructure in areas like 5G, fiber optic links, undersea cables, and infrastructure connected to satellite navigation. For example, this past June, Huawei, a Chinese company, announced an agreement with a Chinese container operator, the 6th largest in the world, to establish a 5G innovation hub. Because China lacks an independent judiciary and there are extensive security vulnerabilities in Huawei products, we are concerned critical sectors could be vulnerable to China as China links port developments with its technology exports and its diplomatic engagements. So how are we responding to this challenge? DoD's response is guided by our national defense strategy, which identifies great power competition as our principal priority. Increasing lethality and strengthening alliances and partnerships are long-term undertakings for competing with China, and I'm glad to be leading a new office within the Defense Department dedicated to assisting in this role. Critically, the National Defense Strategy also states that the Defense Department will support interagency approaches and work by, with, and through our allies and partners. The most important takeaway from our discussion is this: we need economic, diplomatic, and security efforts to respond to China's maritime Silk Road activities. DoD supports this whole-of-government response in three ways. First is by that we provide assessments to our interagency counterparts to identify which of China's investments have national security implications from the maritime Silk Road. Second, we work to deepen security partnerships and underwrite stability, enabling economic and diplomatic tools to succeed. We don't seek to counter China dollar for dollar here, but to play to our strengths by promoting shared principles, developing high-standard alternatives for acute needs, and working with our allies and partners hand in hand. Finally, we share best practices with other countries for engaging with China's military. We encourage carefully scoped defense engagements, hard discussions on the risks of China's military presence, national security-based investment screening, and a risk-based security framework for issues like 5G. This helps build long-term principles-based approaches to address this risk. We welcome the subcommittee's continued attention to this issue and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. General Tuck.
Good afternoon, Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for your invitation to be here today. I'd like to add my condolences on the passing of your fellow committee member, Representative Elijah Cummings, an icon who will be missed. I appreciate your time and willingness to discuss China's Maritime Silk Road initiatives and the implications of the global maritime supply chain. Our ability to project and sustain power globally at a time and place of our choosing remains our strategic comparative advantage, and it's imperative to our ability to ensure the balance of power remains in our favor. Logistics underwrites deterrence. I'll focus my comments today on the impact of China's Maritime Silk Road initiative to that of the Department of Defense, specifically to the global transportation system and logistics. I'll begin with just a comment on background and context of where our maritime industry is today, impact to national defense strategy, and then what the future may look like and our opportunities to shape it. I'd like to start to provide the context of today versus where we were in the Gulf War, Chairman, where you started us today on your conversation. 1990, we had hundreds of U.S. flagships, depending on what metric you're looking at, 400 or so, and then 29,000 plus mariners. Today, 82 is the number, sir, that you quoted, which is accurate, for international trade. And if you take a look at 11,700 or so mariners, just under 12,000, that's a whopping number less than what we had back just a few years ago. So what does this dwindling fleet mean to the Department of Defense? We rely very heavily on the commercial maritime sector to transport a lethal and ready force and sustain our operations. The age of the sealift fleet continues to increase and the readiness continues to drop. Fewer ships are available to provide steady jobs for our mariners, and which also impacts our shipyards. Many of today's mariners are dual-hatted, as you know, both commercial mariners and reservists. The results of this combination leave some uncertainty as to whether a wartime demand can be satisfied. The Maritime Administration estimates the shortage of about 1,800 or so during sustained military operations. It'll be impacting. We are increasingly concerned as we see China continue to maneuver geopolitically, economically, militarily, pursuing its goal to become the regional leader and a great power. In doing so, the Maritime Silk Road Initiative may affect our ability to execute the national defense strategy in the future if we don't change our trajectory, specifically our ability to project power and sustain combat operations. Expanding Chinese influence could limit our ability to use ports, access ships, expose data, and the like. Additionally, it could strain or change our relationships with partners and allies. U.S. Transportation Command pays particular attention to dozens of ports across the globe, monitoring potential threats to the joint deployment and distribution enterprise. I point you to the port of Djibouti as just an example. Its strategic location, crossroads of shipping lanes of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Our military camp that's there, and the Chinese have an operation there as well. There's tension between these two bases, and that's just one example that I'll leave you with. One significant impact of DoD operations in cyberspace domain, shipping data that transits the port and subsequent IT systems are at risk of being exposed, compromised, contributing to Chinese artificial intelligence industry. Chinese influence can limit our footprint, reduce our throughput, or jeopardize access. Our partners may not be able to assist or work with us when we need them due to Chinese influence. So given the picture, where to go from here, we need to take a proactive approach and seek opportunities to shape our future with a whole-of-government approach. To minimize the effects of the Maritime Silk Road Initiative by China, we really have to pay attention to recapitalizing our sea lift fleet, which is U.S. Transportation Command's #1 priority, ensure sufficient workload for U.S.-flagged vessels, create incentives to develop and retain our mariners. I truly appreciate your time today. Thank you for this opportunity. I hope you'll find this to be informative and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Ms. Bartholomew.
Thank you very much, and I join everybody in condolences on the loss of Mr. Cummings. The arc of his life really is an example of the promise of this country and the best that we have to offer. He will be really missed. Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. It is an honor to appear before you and to serve on this panel with such distinguished witnesses. The views in this testimony are informed by the Commission's body of work. They are, however, my own and do not necessarily reflect the full U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Our commission was created by the Congress in 2000 as China acceded to the WTO to advise you on the national security implications of the U.S.-China economic relationship and to make recommendations to Congress on our findings. Our 2019 report is in press right now and will be released in November. The Commission first discussed China's Belton Road Initiative in our 2015 annual report. Much has changed since then. The BRI is the signature foreign policy of General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, and it has become a pillar of China's expanding presence on the global stage. Chinese leaders want to use BRI, of which the Maritime Silk Road is a critical component, to revise the global political and economic order to align with Chinese interests. In my testimony, I would like to situate China's Maritime Silk Road activities in the bigger economic picture, focusing on two key aspects: China's industrial policies for its shipping and shipbuilding industries, and China's investment in ports around the world. First, on China's industrial policies. Like other industries, the Chinese government has focused on and built. China's shipping and shipbuilding firms benefit from industrial policies to the detriment of U.S. companies. China's largest shipping and shipbuilding companies are all state-owned enterprises. A 2017 Harvard University study found evidence that China had significantly subsidized shipyard costs, leading to substantial misallocation of global production. Subsidies for Chinese shipbuilding SOEs have harmed the U.S. shipbuilding industry's ability to compete in the global market and have led to shipyard closings and a reduced U.S. vendor base over the past several decades. Second, to the very important issue of ports. China is the world's largest exporter and second largest importer, so its investment in ports helps facilitate China's global trade footprint. Today, at least 2/3 of the world's top 50 container ports are Chinese-owned or invested, up from about 1/5 almost a decade ago. China's investments include U.S. ports such as Los Angeles and Seattle, and 4 Chinese SOEs are among the world's leading port operators. Chinese control of ports can be used as a form of market creation through which China can leverage its port control to strengthen their economic relationships with certain countries. By owning and/or operating a network of logistical nodes across Asia, Europe, and Africa, China can control a significant portion of its inbound supply chain for essential commodities and outbound trade routes for its exports. In the event of conflict, China could use its control over these and other ports to hinder trade access to other countries. Additionally, Chinese port investment can translate into increased political leverage. Chinese investments in the port of Piraeus in Greece, for example, have influenced Athens' response to China's claims and activities in the South China Sea and human rights abuses, with Athens blocking an EU consensus in 2017 by refusing to endorse an EU statement critical of China's human rights records in the UN Human Rights Council. Finally, control of ports could also allow for economic and traditional espionage, as China can install surveillance equipment in ports to monitor foreign companies and U.S. military activity or that of our allies and partners. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned standards. A couple of other people have mentioned that. This is an issue that we think people really need to be paying more attention to. It's really critically important for the U.S. to participate actively in standard-setting bodies, including the IMO and the ISO. In the IMO, China is a 2018-2019 member of the Council, which is the 40-country body elected by the Assembly, and it serves as the executive body of the IMO. It also serves the Assembly's role between sessions of the Assembly, which generally meets once every 2 years. In the ISO, in addition to its leadership position on the Technical Committee on Ships and Maritime Technology, China is currently a member of the 20-member Council, which is the core governing body of the ISO. Membership on the Council rotates. The U.S. is also currently a member. In 2015 to 2017, the ISO president was from China. But within the ISO, the Technical Committee on Ships and Maritime Technology, ISO TC8, is responsible for the standardization of design, construction, structural elements, outfitting parts, equipments, method and technology, and marine environmental matters used in shipbuilding and the operation of ships, comprising seagoing ships, vessels for inland navigation, offshore structures, ship-to-shore interface, and all other marine structures subject to IMO requirements. ISO TC8's secretariat is China's Standardization Administration. I have been reading recently The Guns at Last Light, The War in Western Europe, 1944 to 1945, by Rick Atkinson, which describes the extensive level of logistics that went into preparing for D-Day. Our sailors, merchant marines, longshoremen, and factory workers, as well as our soldiers, were critical to that mission and to helping win the war. I hope that we never face a task like that again. But I worry that if we do, we no longer have the manufacturing capacity, the shipbuilding capacity, and the elements of the shipbuilding industry that would be necessary to meet the challenge. China has built its economy and its military power under the U.S. security umbrella. It is gaining long-term economic and strategic influence through subsidizing its shipping and shipbuilding industries and investing in overseas ports. We must develop and run a whole-of-government approach to addressing the challenges that it presents. In my written testimony, I have included a list of recommendations the Commission has previously made on maritime security, as well as a map illustrating the global scope of BRI and China's quest for influence. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Bartholomew. We will now proceed to member questions. Observing the 5-minute rule, begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. This question is a general question for the panel, but maybe best directed at General Tuck. You know, just back from the region, I know you have to think about worst-case scenarios. If in a situation where we had an active conflict develop in the South China Sea, on the Korean Peninsula, on the island of Taiwan, and we had to move large numbers of American forces to the region in a hurry, what would that look like? What would you be up here telling us? What would the realities of that challenge be given the state of our maritime infrastructure?
Sir, thanks for the question. I think what's different today than previously, where we could set the conditions and arrive in a place like Saudi with hundreds of thousands of troops and actually just build up that sustainment to do the things that we needed to do. Now you're talking about fighting a near-peer adversary, if that's what we're talking about, dropping and going to and bringing either fighting tonight or or bringing a decisive force into a highly contested environment. So that in and of itself is going to present a challenge.
Well, just so we're clear, this is not some esoteric scenario. I mean, we've all read, I assume, President Xi's statements about Taiwan. We all understand the realities of what's going on in the Korean Peninsula. This is a real possibility. We see what's happening in Hong Kong. So what does that look like? So we're talking about a worst case scenario. None of us wants or hopes to find ourselves there. But in that event, when we turn and say, how are we going to move these forces to that region in a hurry, what are we looking at?
Yeah, so what you're looking to do is mobilize the department to be able to activate ships that belong to the Maritime Administration, put them under the Military Sealift Command. So a quantity of those ships that reside in the Navy Sealift Command added with the maritime community. On top of that, leveraging vessels that are in the commercial sector, which you are going to have to need to do this, and then have the mariner pool available to be able to do this, and start sending all of these forces to a coast to get on vessels and then start moving to where they're intended to go.
I appreciate that. And if you look at each of those elements that you just specified, how would you describe the status of each of those components of that response?
Okay, so
We ready? Are they robust? Is
so-
everything you could hope for, or is it something
yes,
else?
sir. U.S. Transportation Command, just within the last few weeks, activated 33 ships out of the Navy Sealift Command, which was Military Sealift Command, 6 of those ships, 27 out of the Maritime Administration, to get them out of a reduced status, put some port activity together, do sea trials. And so we hadn't done something of that size and magnitude in years, and it gave us an opportunity to take a look at a scorecard and see how we did from a readiness perspective. And we're still cranking through what that might look like from a report perspective to be able to share that information with our leadership. But just the significance of doing something like that we hadn't done before, we're taking readiness very seriously, as you know. Then you transfer to the commercial industry, and I take a look at the commercial industry and I put them in basically 4 bins. What's strategic impact? What's the strategic value of our commercial industry base? What's their readiness, their performance? And then lastly, if we needed to take a look at cost, that would factor in. But based on that, we take a look at the fact that in the past, we were really good at rotating forces in on top of brigade combat teams. Now we're deploying brigade combat teams across the globe. And so that muscle memory of what we've used to do early in the 90s, we now have attained, and we're very successful in that sphere.
And what are the risks you see then? And Ms. Bartholomew or Mr. Bragia, feel free to weigh in. But tell me about the risks, sir. Like, what should we be focused on here? And what kind of 1, 2, 3 investments would you recommend if this committee were going to get active on that subject?
So the risk is that we're operating on old ships. And so Navy Sealift recapitalization is very important. The mariner pool that we have today is being used both in commercial and in its reserve capacity. So you're using both sectors, if you will, with one pool to get that done. And so that's important. I think advocating for a maritime security program and funding it and having the ability to not only resources, but signal to industry that we have a plan for you to keep these ships viable, U.S. flagships, to be able to use at the time and place that we need to is also critical. But those are just 3 examples of where I think we should put the weight of this committee.
I thank the gentleman. I see my time has expired. I'm going to yield to Mr. Gibbs, but I appreciate that the others may have something to say on that subject. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. You know, this is really, to me, it's alarming testimony, what's happening, because when you talk about, like Ms. Bartholomew, when you talk about, you know, the economic and then the military, and those are intertwined. You know, I've always said in this country we have a strong economy, strong military, the world's safer. But if one of those isn't there, it's not as, there's issues. And then, of course, now with the negotiations with China and trade, this all kind of fits together, and what's going on in Hong Kong and, of course, Taiwan, as the chairman mentioned. I guess to start off, General. Thank you for your service. And back in, what was it, 91, when we kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, we mobilized some of our maritime fleet to move equipment over there, correct? And I think you said in your testimony, we've gone from 400 ships down to 84, something like that. About when we did that, how much capacity did we use of our capacity to get that armament over to Kuwait, over to the Middle East? And then how, if we compare today, what's our ability to do something like that today?
Yep, so, sir, I'll take your question as one on scale. What we were asked to do back in the 90s was to support an effort based on plans back then that were related to square foot. Square foot required to do day-to-day operations and square feet required to surge. So far, if you take a look at the plans today to do the things that we need to across the globe, there's a certain amount of square feet that's required to be able to move the U.S. military where it needs to be. And right now, we have enough to do what we need to do. The only difference in conversation between back then and now is the inventory of capabilities that we have to be able to prosecute the national defense strategy is much limited today versus, and you know this, versus what we had back then. And so for us to shift from one combatant commander's resources and move them to another part of the globe adds to this discussion.
And of course, our assets today on the maritime side to do that, the assets, the boats, ships are much older, right? And that's an issue.
Yes, sir. Yes,
So
sir.
we're really in a very precarious position, right?
We really are. Some of the vessels are approaching their end-of-use life, so the strategy would be you're either going to extend some of these ships, you're going to buy used to get some of them faster at a lower rate, not taking away, hopefully, shipyard business, because you're going to maintain and modify ships or put the yards to use to do that, and then buy new. And with this approach, I think we can help the delta of the gap that we're seeing. Unless we do something very soon, we're going to find ourselves just widening the gap of capacity that we need.
I'm really concerned. I see the map with all the countries there where, like almost 130 countries where China has a foothold in there because they put investments in there. And I know when you invest in a business or create a partnership with a person to do a business, you usually has some say so. You've got some clout. And so I guess, Mr. Raja, what's your concerns about what's going on there, and what can we do as a country to try to offset some of those initiatives that China's doing? And obviously they can do some of this because their system of government, it's easier for them to do it. But how concerned are you moving forward if they stay in the same track?
Thank you. That's a great question. I will tell you is I certainly refer you to the written statement that we submitted, and then a little bit of my opening comments as well. But I'll underscore Lieutenant General Tuck's comments, which is, I understand, I think we understand China pretty well, that by 2050, they have aspirations to achieve a world-class military. And when I talk to them and ask them about what that means, their single aspiration is to elevate their own status and capacity on a global scale, even if they haven't figured out in quite detail. What it does mean is that they will have a global military where the U.S. essentially may have no safe harbors, to echo General Tuck's comment, which is it will not look like it did in the past. We will have to move across a space an entire way that could be contested, both for ourselves and our allies from the start and in all domains, and we need to take that seriously. The challenge for the United States is to set conditions in our favor, certainly both for deterrence and, if necessity, to prevail. Our advocacy is internally as we laid out, but certainly here is why we applaud this subcommittee addressing this challenge, which is it branches out across multiple lanes, and you can't artificially bifurcate this issue into one single element. It's going to take all of us working together to do this. Certainly, I would call for further advocacy with our allies and partners to make them aware of this and understand that they will need the whole-of-government approach, and certainly for us to deepen our exploration of areas about where they're going to go, not just to where they've been in the past, where it's going to go in the future. I'll use one case example is is the Arctic. It was raised earlier today. The DoD wrote a report on our Arctic strategy in June 2019, this June, and it covers three things: building awareness, enhancing operations, and upholding a rules-based order. These are the type of areas that we have not had to contend with in the past that we'll have to orient on better.
I'm out of time. I would just say in closing, we got to be really careful with, to address this issue because we could be held hostage, and just economically and, of course, militarily. I yield back.
Thanks, gentlemen. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartholomew, thanks for helping us out today. Are there any, has the commission looked at whether or not any U.S. companies are either involved in either operation, technical advice, or construction on any BRI projects?
We have, I think, do we do a chart in our 2018 report? We can provide for you some information. Most of the U.S. companies that are involved in BRI projects are involved as subcontractors. They're having a tough time breaking into the full contracting thing. So, not surprisingly, the Chinese government is doing here what it does other places, which is it is making these projects advantageous for Chinese companies, bringing in Chinese workers, and making it difficult for U.S. and other companies to get involved. Well, our staff will get to your staff a list of the companies.
Yeah, and is the commission report in recently or in the future, will you have an opinion on whether U.S. companies should participate at all?
We probably would not come to a consensus on that. We have not taken a position. I mean, our belief is that U.S. companies should have opportunities around the world, so I don't think that we would be saying that they shouldn't be participating in those projects, but what we are is disappointed that if China is indeed going to spend as much money as it says it's going to spend on infrastructure, that our companies, which have a lot of experience, should have opportunities to participate there.
Yeah, that was the opinion of the administration when it sent a U.S. representative delegation in 2017 to China to the first BRI or OBOR at the time conference as well. Has the commission, you mentioned Seattle and LA as two ports, as other ports as well. They don't operate, the Chinese companies don't operate the ports, they operate individual terminals at ports, so it's not like they're operating an entire port. Has the commission developed or have you studied whether or not these ports that have Chinese operators of individual terminals have taken any steps at all to protect shipping data, to protect communications, to do anything that causes the concerns that that we've heard from the panel today?
We have not specifically looked at that. It's something we could certainly try to look into. I don't know how much information the ports will actually share on some of those things. I will express, I know 5G was mentioned, sort of the broader concern about where Chinese technology is getting into communication systems and the data that they're able to gather and what they're able to do with that. So there is there's certainly, I would say that I certainly have a concern about that, although I don't have any specific information to answer your question.
Yeah, I guess one of my points then is it's nice to point out a problem, but it'd be better to hear some solutions as well on that point.
Absolutely, that's the case. I'd also say it would be good to make sure that we can try to prevent these problems as much as we can.
Yeah, right. On that point, with regards to technology standards, IMO and ISO, and this gets to the Huawei issue as well, and ZTE, about 35% of the standards essential patents for 5G are actually owned by Chinese-based companies like Huawei or ZTE or state-owned enterprises. And about 15% of those standards essential patents are owned by U.S. companies. So we're focused a lot on the name on the box as opposed to the guts inside the box. And so if the standards essential patents are owned by Huawei, it doesn't, that piece will end up in a non-Huawei box because it's a standards essential patent. And so it gets into the standard setting issue. And so the question I have for you is, it's again one thing to point out at ISO and IMO that there's a problem, but what are we doing to show up and make the argument and be in the room when the votes are taken about what these standards are going to be?
Well, Mr. Larson, I mean, I think you're putting your finger on a very important point, which is to make sure that we are showing up and that we are we are participating in these. One thing the Commission has done, not IMO and ISO specific, is that we have we've done a database of where the Chinese government is involved in multinational organizations, multilateral organizations, because they consistently, it's a strategy, right? I mean, they are consistently putting people into positions where they can help determine what standards are going to be. I recognize that the Huawei situation, the technology, it's complicated stuff. You know, things are developed in different places and they're manufactured in different places, and it's complicated stuff. Our role is really to point out some of the concerns about potential problems, and as I said, to try to make sure that we prevent those. But
I'm out of time. I'd just say in conclusion, we're playing a lot of defense and not a lot of offense here, and I'd like to see us open up the other side of that playbook. And that goes to everybody at the table.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you. Whenever we talk about China, I'm always struck by what I perceive to be the level of bipartisan consensus on this issue, which I think is remarkable. At a time when Congress is divided, I think, on the most important strategic issue, not just of today, but perceivably for the next 2 decades, there's a ton of bipartisan support for a more realistic, if not aggressive, posture with respect to Chinese influence, expanding influence around the world. And so that's something we should continue to foster, and thank you for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman. That gives me a lot of hope. Not to say we agree on everything. Sometimes you guys are wrong about things, and I'm right. But I just think that's a very, very good thing. And looking at the map, you can't help but notice that the BRI projects overlap with a lot of the key sea lines of communication and maritime choke points, and the chairman sort of referenced Mahanian theory earlier. And I'd just be curious, Lieutenant General Tuck, as a professional logistician, if you were seeking militarily to dominate and, if necessary, shut down the world's key trade and military supply nodes, how similar would be the areas you'd want to control compared to where the PRC is going with BRI?
Thanks for the question. We do share the same concern that you just raised, sir, with respect to global choke points. And just like was mentioned earlier, we just have to be present there, not just watching, but actually present. So if you take a look at ports like the Suez, Red Sea, Panama Canal, Malaccan Straits, where it's very vital to have freedom of navigation, just from a rules order perspective and the law, international law. And so our partnerships with countries that are working, that either are part of the equation, and our partnership there it's just going to be impactful and enormous for us to consider. And this is now a whole of government approach on how we actually make sure that we have the access that we need. And so I really think that working with our allies and partners, which is part of the National Defense Strategy, is key. We have to keep the conversation going. And if you're thinking about just in our own hemisphere, working with the folks south of Mexico, it's very vital and important. So from an interoperability, exercising, mill-to-mill dialogues, relationships, key leadership engagements, I think they're going to remain pivotal in ensuring that we have access to the areas that you talked about. And so that is a priority that, as I pay attention to working with combatant commanders to make sure that we do that, working with the J5 and how we interact with our embassies, our state representatives out there to keep the dialogue going and fostering the development that we need to have with these countries.
I appreciate that. One area where I always feel like we give it short shrift, maybe just because CENTCOM and INDOPACOM take up most of our time, is AFRICOM. And certainly we've seen the Chinese militarize their presence in Djibouti. Going east of that, Gwadar may be the next sort of port to follow. But do you, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this, Sprasia, did I get that? Close enough? You're allowed to correct a member of Congress. It's not. Do you expect to see the Chinese government militarize other ports and locations along the Belton Road?
Yeah, they absolutely. It's very evident and clear. I've talked to the Chinese military personally about this issue. They have an aspiration to do so. I did reference earlier about China's 2019 Defense White Paper published by their state council. I've had discussions with them and their principal authors at both their Academy of Military Science and National Defense University with the oversight of their Office of International Military Cooperation, who was the principal pen. It was absolutely clear of what their intent is to not only take Djibouti, which I think my personal view is best viewed as a test case of how you start this practice, how you do best practices, how do you set up a port, how you do communications work, how do you do all the overseas command and control functions. That is a first step. It's not the last step. So you're going to see that come more often, and they told us that directly, both in terms of the aspiration to do it and to further mature how they do those things.
Well, thank you for the work you're doing, and again, thank you for holding this hearing.
I thank the gentleman, Mr. Garamendi.
General Tuck. Are you aware that the U.S. Navy cannot fuel the fleet with American vessels?
I'm sorry, sir, can you?
Are you aware that the U.S. Navy cannot fuel its fleet with American vessels? The answer is yes. You are aware, and the U.S. Navy cannot provide fuel for its fleet with American vessels. Okay?
Okay.
Are you aware that the U.S. is exporting oil and gas?
Yes.
Okay. Are you aware that none of this fuel is on American-flagged and owned ships?
I'm not.
The answer is
Yeah.
none of the oil and gas is on none of the gas is on American-flagged ships. Some of the oil is. Are you aware that there is legislation that could take a small percentage of that oil and gas and lead to the construction of perhaps 50 American-flagged, owned, and built vessels,
Yes.
thereby solving part of the problem that the U.S. Navy has?
Yes, sir, I am.
Good. Then I'd like to have the support of Transcom for that legislation. It's called Energizing the American Shipbuilding Industry.
I'm aware of it, sir.
Good. So where's the support? You've got a problem. You've got a very, very serious problem. You don't have American ships that are under American control. To fuel the U.S. Navy, you have to rely on Chinese ships to do it. So we got a problem. I appreciate your insight into it. And I suppose that the political appointees also ought to be aware. Are you?
Congressman, there's clear aspects of that I am aware of, not all of them.
Good.
Our job is to get busy figuring those
The
out.
bottom line here is, we sit here and we talk about these things forever, and we have for at least the last half dozen years, if not longer. I've yet to see this administration step forward with a solution to the problem. There's one at hand. It would simply require that a small percentage of our exported oil and gas be on American-built ships. Also, it could lead to a significant reduction in the cost of naval vessels. An example was given to me yesterday that if there was competition for a small naval vessel that didn't exist before, but a new competitor entered the market, the cost savings was 40% from what was anticipated. If we were to build vessels in the United States, for example, oilers and LNG vessels, we might have more competition in our shipyards with a reduced price to the U.S. Navy for its kinetic vessels, which, by the way, can't get to where they need to go because they don't have the fuel to get there. So, beyond that, a question having to do with the islands in the Pacific, some of the little-known islands in the Pacific. Is it true that the Chinese are building significant ports in many of these obscure, little-known islands out in the Pacific? Any one of you want to answer that? Ms. Bartholomew?
Well, we know that they're dramatically increasing their presence. I think there's one of the islands, which is the island, Dan, which island did they got port on or not yet?
Let's see, there's in Loganville, in Vanuatu.
Yes,
Yeah.
We have that.
yes,
It's supposed to be for fishing, but it's big enough for the largest Chinese ships.
yeah.
Gee, what's that all about?
Yeah.
Any of you have any idea what that's all about?
I think we have to presume that we know what it could be about. I would say I've been in the region twice in the past 6 months, and certainly the Australians are engaging with the United States and having a greater presence generally in the Pacific Islands.
Do we have
There is growing concern
Is
in the
there an
region.
American strategy to deal with this?
I can't answer that. I'm a congressional advisory. Is there an American strategy to deal with it?
Yes, sir.
I
So,
think
sir,
there is, actually.
the example that you quoted about China building a wharf in Vanuatu, for instance, it's coming with some problems. But the one thing I can share with you is that the Pacific Area Symposium for Logistics, senior officers, 29 or 30 countries get together. They meet in the Pacific annually. These are the small countries that come, and we talk about either bilat or multilat, sharing of information of what the Chinese might be doing and what we might be doing out there. The reason why this is important to talk to you about, sir, is because there's a lot of islands out there that want us to come in and be a part of them versus them wanting to do something elsewhere. And I
what
think
are
that
we
that's
doing
important for us to take on.
address their desire to be partners? I'm out of time. The answer is little, if anything. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, could I just clarify one thing, which is there has been recent reports that the Chinese are leasing the island of Tulagi from the Solomon Islands, and it was an island that was important in our World War II Pacific War. And a lot of people are very upset, both in the Solomon Islands and elsewhere.
There's also a place called Subic Bay
Yes.
that is about to be taken over by a Chinese company.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank the gentleman. Thank the witnesses. Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Maloney. The gentleman from California has certainly altered some of my speaking, so to speak. I represent West Virginia, and trade is very important to West Virginia because we export timber, coal, oil, and gas, and we are always interested in fair trade. The presence of the infrastructure development to me is very concerning. Lieutenant General Tuck, what are the U.S. military's concerns with the Chinese military showing so much force in Southeast Pacific and the South China Sea?
Ma'am, thanks for your question. I mean, from what we've been seeing for years, and you all have been seeing it too, they are trying to bolster their own regional security. They're trying to bolster their own sphere of influence. And from at least from the lens that I sit in as a logistics officer for the Joint Staff, it's, again, I'm going back to rules-based order, international law, freedom of navigation. I'm responsible, at least in advising the chairman, on access, basing, and overflight or freedom of navigation. So how do we best do this? And I go back to, at least since you called out the South China Sea, ma'am, the Indo-PACOM Pacific strategy, which talks about posture and presence. We have to be out there. And so that's something that I would like to have resonated with this committee. It's about partnership capacity to be able to have our relationships that we have with not only our Five Eye partners, and it's not necessarily just the U.S., but it's Japan and India, it's Australia and Vietnam, it's Vietnam and New Zealand. It's those kinds of arrangements that are going to help areas like the South China Sea maintain rules-based order, freedom of navigation, so that commerce and economy can flow. And then last but not least is this idea that we all know about, it's interoperability. Not only is it good for us to partner when there's a humanitarian disaster that happens in that part of the world, to show that we can be trusted as a partner by bringing our military assets to bear and bringing life-saving skills or recovery efforts for places like Nepal and the earthquake there, or Malaysia and earthquake or tsunamis and the like. But that hand that we lend as a military in times like that can lend incredible trust when it comes to having to then demonstrate why it's important for us to be present when it comes to freedom of navigation and making sure that commerce flows the way it needs to.
And you called that partnerability?
I call it building partnership capacity.
Partnership capacity. Okay, thank you. Mr. Spragia, what steps has the Trump administration taken to drive China to join the international community on trade standards agreed to by members of the World Trade Organization? And have these efforts been successful?
Congresswoman, that's a great question. I got to tell you, that's a bit outside the scope of my expertise. My concentration is on DoD issues. We're fully supportive and participate across interagency efforts and certainly advocate to align those issues. But for trade issues, I'm not the best person to talk about.
Would either the other?
I can try addressing that a little bit and preface it with the U.S. ambassador to the WTO, Dennis Shea, was a long-serving member of this commission, so he is very well steeped in the U.S.-China issues, and I think that the administration is certainly trying to make some changes at the WTO that would address the bigger challenges that China has created there.
Do you expect these ongoing negotiations to continue?
I can say that I hope that they continue. It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen.
Okay, what role can Congress play in making sure that the United States will continue to be prepared for world conflicts and disasters?
I'm sure we would all have answers to that. I would say that it's certainly important for us to strengthen our relationships with friends and allies, in this case, in the region, in Asia, but around the world, because we're going to need to be able to work with them to address any problems that might arise. To me, that's one of the most important things. And again, traveling in Asia, it's one of the concerns that we hear, that people aren't sure of our commitment. They're not sure that they can rely on us, and I think they need to be convinced that they can.
Absolutely. Thank you. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Lowenthal. Gentleman from California is recognized.
It's hard to hear you all the way over here in California. I represent the Port of Long Beach. I live in Long Beach, and I'm on the co-chair of the Ports Caucus. And so I hear, or my staff, probably more than even me, hear from ports across the country. And one of the things I hear is the fear that they have that there are going to be, or there could be, gets pushed off, but of increased tariffs on the ship-to-shore cranes, the cranes that come from China that all of our ports use. So I'm wondering, maybe Ms. Bartholomew, you can, what are the implications of having us so reliant on Chinese equipment for our ports? That's really, in my port, what's going on, not so much the terminal. It is the terminal. China had to sell one of the terminals, but it's the reliance on the equipment. Maybe you could talk to us about that and what that means. And does China use leverage when they have that? Again, you know, is this an important tool because we're so dependent on their equipment, their cranes?
Well, I think we see the use of leverage on other products. I can't say that I have seen it on the use of cranes, but I think that having us dependent on sort of any one source is a problem, especially when that source is a country that doesn't necessarily see us as a friend. But we have certainly seen them use economic leverage in the tariff war that's taking place. The products that they targeted in response to the president's tariffs were very focused, and we see in their presence, sort of their BRI presence and their presence in the ports, their willingness to use their economic presence and economic power to achieve other means, to achieve diplomatic means and political means. As somebody mentioned Africa earlier, it's a little off of what you're saying, but one of the concerns about Africa is China's growing economic presence there, but their presence in the communication system. They're training journalists, they are They are running the 4G system. They look like they're going to have an edge in the 5G system. And so they're creating an environment where it is very difficult to oppose something that they're saying or doing. So for me, it's a twofold thing. One is the influence that they have, and two is the possibility that they could target that sector and shut down work at our ports if they do that.
That's right. I'm wondering if anybody else on the panel has any thoughts about that. We are so reliant in our ports on Chinese equipment now, cranes and large. Do you see this as a potential threat to the United States?
Sir, thanks for the question. Thanks for allowing me to comment. There was a time when all we needed to do in our country was just really take a look at physical port security, something that the Coast Guard is very well equipped to do. And now you're talking about the resiliency of a port.
Right.
The point that you perfectly raise, and the cyber activity, the AI that could go with that, any amount of technology that you throw at, including these mega cranes that you're referring to, sir. And so there is some concern, absolutely, because the last thing you want as a person responsible for helping combat commanders be successful by moving large military forces to a port to then put them on a conveyance and get them sailing in terms of their equipment, is to have something happen at that port where they don't actually leave. And so without us even getting close to getting out of town, we need to make sure that we have mechanisms in place that can assure that power projection. And so any of these technologies that you mentioned, to include automated systems that are right here in the state of Virginia, could cause some alarm if we don't have the right control mechanisms, the right SCADA, ICS kinds of deliberate systems in place that we can actually protect, so that when we need them to operate, they do operate the way that they're supposed to, versus preventing us from doing the things we need to get out of town. So it is a concern, sir.
Thank you. Any comments on that? Defense worried about that? They have all the equipment in our large equipment in our ports.
I think it's an excellent question. I certainly echo the other panel members. At the strategic level, it's important to make sure that you're measuring the costs and implications of those kind of issues. In the past, we just haven't. I think that was raised. That's something we have to do. Earlier, the congressman raised about what we're doing overseas as well. Those are the same kind of practices that we have to help, and the efforts that we're making now to help our allies and partners out with as well. That's one of the main efforts. It's not just domestic, it's with this larger network. That's certainly part of our Indo-Pacific strategy that we have, is to help do that. It's assessing best practices. It's talking about what the costs are. It's understanding to a greater depth and degree than we have in the past about what the implications are of this and getting serious about it, and understanding that this issue traditionally may be something that the military wouldn't, or the Defense Department wouldn't pay that much attention to, is that we have to, and we have to share with our colleagues across the departments and agencies to understand what those implications are and argue with them about what the choices are that they can help make. One of the reasons we're here today is to do that here.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'm going to move to the second panel, but I do want to associate myself with the gentleman's remarks and underscore how important that issue is. If there is a future 9/11 coming, God forbid, it may be a cyber 9/11. If there's a future Pearl Harbor coming, it may well be a cyber Pearl Harbor. The dependency of U.S. logistics, operations, port infrastructure, the technology, the physical equipment on systems that may be produced or manipulated by our adversaries is real. We should be focused on it. And that's before you even begin talking about the ships themselves that are under different flags. And when you look at the totality of our dependence and its vulnerability to the influence of our near-peer competitors, it is alarming indeed. I want to thank the panel for your testimony, for your service, the work you're doing. We appreciate it. We are going to move to the second panel in the interest of time. I know we've been keeping you waiting a long time, but we do appreciate your presence here today. With that, I'd like to introduce the second panel, give them an opportunity to move to the witness table. Yet, because they might want to. Because we can get our shit together. We're all going to be. I'm getting think Gallagher's right. I mean, we all agree on this stuff. We should. Well, moving now to our second panel, I'd like to welcome our panel of witnesses. We're joined today by Mr. Jonathan E. Hillman, Director of the Reconnecting Asia Project for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Dr. Jeffrey Becker, Research Program Director of the Center for Naval Analysis, and Ms. Kathleen Walsh, Associate Professor of National Security Affairs at the Naval War College. Thank you all for being here today. We look forward to your testimony. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. And as with the previous panel, we'd ask that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes so we can move to the members' questions. With that, Mr. Hillman, you may proceed.
Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Very briefly, I'd like to just touch on 4 areas to help frame the discussion here, drawing on some of the work that we've been doing at CSIS tracking China's activities. So first, despite lots of hype about China's new overland routes through its Belton Road Initiative, the maritime domain really is where the economic action remains and will remain. And I'm happy to get into that more in the discussion, but I think that really does underscore the importance of the hearing today. Second, while the Belton Road Initiative is vague by design, I think it's very clear that China is increasingly dominant across the maritime supply chain. And it's dominant not only, as the last panel was pointing out, and as many of the members have mentioned, China's dominant not only in the operational functions of that supply chain, but the production activities that sit behind those operational functions. So China has the world's largest shipping fleet in terms of number of vessels. It has the world's largest container port operator. It has the world's largest seafarer workforce. It also has the world's largest shipbuilder. And it has the world's largest port construction firms. It produces the most shipping containers. And certainly, China's maritime rise is not an accident or just a byproduct of the fact that it's a very large country, but this is the result of long-standing state policies and generous financial support. So in 2008, there were no Chinese banks among the top 10 shipping finance providers in the world. A decade later, Chinese banks are first and second in the world. Made in China 2025, which is often talked about in terms of its investments in AI and semiconductors and those types of things, also designates shipping technology as one of 10 priority sectors. So again, this is not at all an accident. Third, as many of the panelists mentioned before, China's maritime rise has broad implications for U.S. economic and strategic interests. And I think the U.S.-China trade war has illustrated some of these risks that the U.S. has. Mr. Lowenthal had mentioned, when the Trump administration proposed tariffs on shipping cranes, ship-to-shore cranes, ports in Baltimore, Virginia, and elsewhere asked for exemptions. And that's because U.S. companies haven't made these cranes for decades. And that all works in an environment in which the U.S. and China are partners and cooperating, but when we're shifting to a climate of increased competition, some of those risks emerge. And it's notable that a single Chinese company has 70% of the global market for those ship-to-shore cranes. And so something like ship-to-shore cranes can sound somewhat obscure in the context of a national security discussion, but I think it's not difficult to imagine how some of those maritime capabilities would benefit China in the event of a conflict. Surely China's massive shipbuilding industry also provides a latent capacity that could be harnessed to support military operations. Its network of ports, which includes lots of activities near major choke points, could provide flexibility to disrupt trade as well as adapt to disruptions. But I do think that the main challenges today exist in this space between war and peace, often referred to as the gray zone. And so China's maritime activities are enhancing its intelligence capabilities. It's further complicating the operating environment for U.S. military and diplomatic operations overseas. And as we've seen, China also uses infrastructure as a diplomatic tool to win political concessions. And of course, I should also mention, there are plenty of Chinese maritime activities that are beneficial to the U.S., and this is part of the challenge. Surely the world needs more infrastructure, as long as that infrastructure is delivered properly and at the right standards. And the United States stands to benefit in terms of lower trade costs and growing foreign markets. There are certainly reasons to be concerned about whether China is meeting those standards through its Belt and Road Initiative. Finally, Congress does have a very important role to play in, I think, encouraging and shaping a more strategic response to these developments. At the very least, China's Belt and Road Initiative should be a wake-up call, both for U.S. policies at home and abroad. At home, certainly, it makes sense to think about building stronger and more resilient U.S. capabilities, which will require investing in U.S. infrastructure, investing in vessels to fill gaps in the U.S. fleet, supporting research for advanced maritime technology, and also training the next generation of U.S. mariners. And abroad, I think it's very important that the U.S. does more than criticize the Belt and Road. It needs to put forward its own positive economic vision, and I'd be happy to talk about that more as well. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Becker.
Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts with you today on China's Maritime Silk Road and its implications for the U.S. Navy and the global maritime supply chain. I just want to note briefly that the views I express today are my own, and they're not those of CNA or the Department of Defense. As a result of China's Maritime Silk Road initiative, Chinese state-owned firms have spent billions of dollars on maritime infrastructure. They now build and operate port facilities around the globe. And this raises a number of implications for the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard. As a result of these investments, China is likely improving its ability to collect intelligence on U.S. ships and assets operating in ports overseas. These investments are also allowing China to develop the capabilities that could be used later, such as the capability to interfere with U.S. Navy repair or resupply operations, or the ability to deny U.S. Navy access to certain ports altogether in times of crisis. So first, just to provide some brief background, what are the most common types of Chinese presence in overseas port facilities? So fundamentally, Chinese state firms have expanded their presence in three ways: constructing new port facilities or upgrading existing infrastructure, purchasing stakes in port terminal operators, and operating port facilities directly. Second, Beijing has a record of using economic tools to advance foreign policy objectives, and I see three tools in particular that Chinese SOEs could use to influence activities in overseas ports. One is China's foreign direct investment, which Chinese SOE executives often argue can turn a foreign country into the next economic miracle, just as FDI did for China, for example. Another tool is debt. China has become a major creditor to many emerging economies, and several may have trouble servicing their debts in the near term. And a third is bribery, and we've already seen examples where Chinese executives have sought to channel money to foreign government officials and their family members in countries where they want to do business. So using these tools, who might China target? Well, first, as I just mentioned, we've already seen Chinese firms attempt to influence national-level leaders and their family members with gifts of cash. A second target would be officials that run overseas ports, and this would include actors such as freight forwarding companies, husbanding agents, port captains, or port authorities. These are the individuals that know when ships arrive, where those ships dock, what they carry, where they store their cargo, and when that cargo gets picked up. So Chinese officials could potentially obtain useful information through these relationships. A third would be local leaders that control access to the areas surrounding the port, and Chinese firms often seek to develop these areas as part of a larger all-encompassing development model. And all this brings me to my most important issue. What might China do to affect U.S. Navy or U.S. Coast Guard port operations overseas? And I see four issues. First, I think it's worth noting that Chinese overseas expansion may create challenges for the U.S. Navy, regardless of whether or not this is China's intent. More Chinese commerce and Chinese activity means that in some locations, the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Coast Guard may face more competition, with more ships vying for limited facilities. A second issue is that Chinese state firms may be able to collect intelligence on the movement and the location of U.S. Navy ships, ship maintenance requirements, combat readiness, and the procedures that the U.S. Navy uses for repair, resupply, and other activities while they're operating in foreign ports. Moreover, as Chinese firms work with Huawei and others on port IT infrastructure issues, this puts U.S. Navy communications and other information at risk as well. Third, China could potentially pressure non-Chinese firms to give U.S. Navy or U.S. Coast Guard ships lower priority than they currently enjoy, thus slowing down services and potentially throwing ships off their schedules. To be clear, I don't have any examples of this happening to date, but given China's importance to the maritime industry, firms that provide services to the U.S. Navy may have enough commercial interest in China to be sensitive to these types of overtures. And then fourth, China could seek to restrict U.S. Navy access to ports where Chinese SOEs have a large presence in order to express their displeasure at U.S. activities. However, I have to say I do find such an action to be unlikely to date, primarily for two key reasons. First, it would certainly make other countries sit up and take notice at a time when countries are already concerned about ceding sovereignty to China. Second, and perhaps most importantly, U.S. Navy ships visiting these ports may provide intelligence collection opportunities, so China has an interest in those visits continuing. Regardless, responding to China's growing role in overseas maritime infrastructure will require careful consideration from the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard about where, when, and how it operates in overseas ports in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. Ms. Walsh.
Thank you, Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'd like to add my condolences to the earlier panel. I was hoping maybe to get to meet Congressman Cummings, so my loss as well as yours. This is an important topic, one that doesn't get as much attention as I think it warrants in my own view, so I commend the committee for focusing on this topic. I have to note as well, these represent my personal views and not those of the U.S. government, Department of Defense. I'll give you the bottom line up front. The United States and China are in a geostrategic and economic competition in which development of the ocean economy, also referred to as a maritime or blue economy, will play a critically important and particularly from a maritime, commercial, and naval technology point of view, important role. This competition will determine the future of the global maritime supply chain. China has a comprehensive long-term strategy, vision, policies, and plans to develop the ocean economy, both at home and abroad. The United States does not. The OECD in 2016 put out an important report on the ocean economy in 2030, noting that the ocean economy makes a significant contribution to the overall economy, saying that in 2010, the ocean economy contributed $1.5 trillion, and by 2030, estimating that $3 trillion will be value-added growth. This important strategic sector is particularly important in an age of global trade, investment, and innovation, maritime industry expansion, demographic shifts towards coastal zones, climate change, and an emerging or growing naval contest between the United States and China. How and where the ocean economy develops will determine the future of the global maritime industry, affecting key aspects such as infrastructure and transportation, where the source and centers of maritime innovation will emerge, and which countries will dominate in determining maritime law, policy, processes, and as mentioned earlier, technical standards, hardware, software, environmental measures, and others, both on land and at sea. Two important global trends that I'd like to focus on here that are fueling development of the ocean economy globally and that are sure to impact the global maritime supply chain are first, the expanding numbers and types of special economic zones, or SEZs, that include specialized maritime industrial themed development zones. And then secondly, a related concept of developing maritime clusters or innovation ecosystems that are designed to spur maritime industrial and also blue economic growth, technological innovation, and doing so in a more sustainable way. China is at the forefront of both of these global trends. The UN Conference on Trade and Development, its annual report on world investment, had a special section on special economic zones because they're, as UNCTAD put it, explosive growth in the use of special economic zones around the world. China alone accounts for over 2,500 of all the world's SEZs, nearly half of the worldwide total, and then more than half of those that are in developing countries. China has also pioneered a new form of special economic zone that is focused on enhancing maritime, both commercial and naval, capabilities by establishing a specialized and pilot blue economy development zone. The first being in Qingdao, China, but also now establishing these along China's long coastline. Within the Qingdao Blue Economic Development Zone, they also have what they call Blue Silicon Valley, the idea being clearly to advance innovation in the marine and maritime sector. In addition, China's Blue Economy Development Zones are strategically located with military and defense industrial interests in mind, As you've noted, become commonly understood, China's long-term economic and technological development model remains based on dual use combined and what they call now military-civil fusion of technology development and innovation that is intended for both commercial and defense purposes. This strategic approach applies to the maritime sector as well and will affect how and the degree to which U.S. and Chinese maritime stakeholders can engage, whether in China or overseas, and as part of the global maritime supply chain. Under the Maritime Silk Road Initiative, China has expanded its efforts to promote overseas SEZs, including overseas blue economy zones and other blue cooperative programs. As noted in the previous panel and the recent New York Times article, for instance, China has leased an entire province in the Solomon Islands for development of a special economic zone, though it's not clear what industrial or military purposes it plans to use it for. But the vehicle is the special economic zone, which is an important part of China's own development and part of the allure or attraction of Chinese foreign investment overseas. In mid-2017, Beijing announced a new vision for maritime cooperation, which built upon the 2015 Belton Action Road Plan. I commend both of these documents to you, to the committee, to understand. They're both in English, easy to understand. Note that the Maritime Vision in particular has a whole litany of development projects, including what it calls blue passages, blue economic corridors, blue partnerships, blue carbon programs, all, of course, with maritime themes, in addition to overseas blue economic zones, in cooperation, as their plan is, with neighboring regional and international partners that stretch across almost all of the globe, all of the Indo-Pacific, and stretching into the Mediterranean, the Arctic, and importantly as well, into the deep ocean. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walsh. I will now proceed to members' questions under the 5-minute rule. Recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Walsh, I'm struck by your testimony. I agree wholeheartedly with the point you're making, but can you tease that out for me a little bit? When you talk about the geostrategic and economic competition, and you point out rightly the range and scope of it, this is unlike the competition we have with other major countries, right? I mean, this is not the same as the global competition we have with Japan or the global competition we have with Germany, or even the pressure on our manufacturing sectors or other industries like shipbuilding that we might find with other emerging economies or nations. Talk about how it's different, and particularly how it depends for its orientation, for its success to date on the authoritarian model that the Chinese have embraced, despite 30 years of economic policy and trade policy and wishful thinking on the behalf of American policymakers that the Chinese are moving closer to our model, but instead, if anything, seem to be accelerating away from it. Can you just talk about how that competition is central to what we see with the Maritime Silk Road, with One Belt Road more broadly, with the Digital Silk Road, and with all of its components?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, for your question. I remember when I first saw the map of the Belton Road, I was shocked, honestly. I've studied China since 1990, so quite a long time, and that is something I never thought I'd see from a Chinese paper or government product. That said, I think that Xi Jinping's China is a very different China than we've seen in the past. I think there was reason to think that we could engage with China in the past, that it was following along or wanting to be part of the international global order, which is based on, as you note, the fundamental rule of law, Western liberal democratic ideals. I think Xi Jinping's China is fundamentally different, and I think it's taken some time to understand that Xi Jinping has a very different view of the international global order, and I was one of the first, I think, to say China is a revisionist power. Under Xi, China does want to remake the international order in a more Chinese model approach. This is fundamentally different and much more concerning than the China of the past. China of old is the same, industrial policies, 5-year plans, long-term plans, that hasn't changed. But what has changed is that China wants to remake and revise the international order, which gets down to that fundamental difference between a communist-led China, Communist Party-led China, and what the international community, U.S. and others have set up, which relies on the rule of law.
And when you say revise and remake, another word would be to displace the United States. What's your view of that?
I would agree with that now. I would not have, 7, 8 years ago, before Xi. I think that was a different China. I think that our strategy may have fit them, but I think our strategy has to adjust to a new and more aggressive China.
And so is it fair that we should, and when we talk about displacing, we're not just talking about displacing us economically from a particular industry or even from a particular region. We're talking about displacing our global economic model with a different one, isn't that right? One led by China. And is it fair that we should understand the components of One Belt, One Road, Maritime Silk Road, Digital Silk Road, all as component elements of a larger strategy to displace the United States and its market-based, rules-based system with the Chinese authoritarian model?
Yes, I'd agree with that, but I'd also caution, as I have before and with others, that this is Xi Jinping's China. I am not convinced that this is going to be China of the future necessarily. It's the China we need to deal with. Obviously, we need a new strategy.
Ms. Walsh, Xi Jinping has made clear that he has no intentions of going anywhere. Isn't that fair? Do you know something I don't about the next Chinese leader? Because I think the next Chinese leader is Xi Jinping.
All right. I would just caution that as a strategist, you want to be prepared for the potential of change to happen. And if that were to happen, we'd want to have that in mind if we were to develop a long-term strategy.
Couldn't agree more. In fact, that's why we're holding this hearing, one of the reasons. But you'd agree that hope isn't a strategy, right? You'd agree that we have something to say about whether we are confronted with this China or the China we had hoped for, the China we hope to see in the future. Mr. Hillman, I only have a few seconds left, but I know you made the point about cooperation with China. None of us wants a purely confrontational relationship with the Chinese. Some of us feel as though we are being pushed in that direction aggressively, and we better be prepared for it. Is it possible to cooperate our way through this global competition? Are we overstating the risks of what we're talking about here today? Are we being too alarmist?
So I think you do have to think through what the risks are, and then you plan toward those. And so I don't think that that's been alarmist at all. I think we're having a healthy reassessment of what interdependence has meant for us. And so I think looking at the maritime dimension of that certainly makes sense. I do think that there's more we can do in terms of our analysis to separate things that are threatening from things that are benign or harmless. Or sort of white elephant projects. So to give you an example, with ports, not every port is some Trojan horse Chinese naval facility. But being able to go through that you need to have information about who's involved and what the port looks like, and there's an art to it. And our government needs to be doing more of that to separate these harmful activities from the ones that are okay and can be encouraged.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you. Ms. Walsh, you talked about how you were surprised when you saw the map. I believe it's this map where there's 92 countries that have formally endorsed the Belton Road project. And of course, most of them are in Asia, some in Africa, a few in South America. But it's interesting when we talk about choke points, Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, Strait of Hormuz, or the Persian Gulf, Panama, and there's countries around the Red Sea, and of course, in the Middle East are all colored red, so they're all part of the Belt and Road project. Obviously, today, our U.S. Navy, keeps those areas open. But I guess I'm just thinking with the initiatives that China's doing, they probably could cause havoc without a military action. Because they got their foot in the door, they control, they make investments there. So it could be political, it could be a mechanical thing, with the assets of the infrastructure. So I mean, what's the course moving forward?
Well, as my colleague said, I would advocate, as you're talking about here, we need a comprehensive strategy to deal with this. China's hard power, ports, and capabilities that they're building literally at sea and on land That's hard power. We know about their Navy and commercial shipbuilding. It's also soft power, which is a part I think you may be getting at too, which is, you develop a special economic zone. That's attractive to a lot of countries around the world. You come in with money and infrastructure, loans and so on. The blue economy is an important soft power asset that China has and we don't. That is something that countries will want. It's maritime industry, jobs, innovation, or at least promised, and also sustainable industry and innovation. That is a soft power tool that will expand that map, I expect. And then finally, as you know, coercion, right? We've seen China use economic coercion in the past. I expect they'll continue to do this. And once you have both the land-based assets and control and the willingness to use it, and then you expand that out to sea, I think that's a whole different way of looking at power and presence that we're not ready yet to deal with.
Now, most of these countries are on this list are not really allies of us. Some are, South Korea, Israel, Jordan, Panama. So, I guess I'm just kind of wondering what's happening here. The carrot approach that China's using by bringing in dollars, capital investment, they're just buying into it. It doesn't matter, or
I think we need a holistic strategy. And much of what I heard in the previous panel, and I often hear, is whole of government, but it really is a defense-oriented, military-oriented allies and partners strategy. I think that's insufficient. I think it needs to be economic, diplomatic, innovative, and of course also military, defense, security. But it's whole of government is too simplistic. It has to be holistic. To me, that means we need a comprehensive strategy, and we need somebody to run that, whether it's one person or one institute, one organization, to focus on this, because it's too much for any of us.
I agree, and I'm glad you held this hearing, Chairman, just to bring this to light, because I don't think most people really understand what's going on. I think a lot of American citizens understand that China, we have a lot of challenges with China, and we're going through with the trade war. I think maybe President Trump's got it right that we've been financing a lot of stuff in China now overseas. Maybe that we get the trade done, we get some equilibrium there, because this is not sustainable, I think, for the future of our country, for our national security. So.
First thing, though, we need to understand the scope and the details, I think, and having a way to do that so that officials and others can really understand, and then come up with the strategy.
And I guess just closing, right now, we still are the superpower. We project our power to promote peace around the world, basically the aircraft carrier groups. And I know China's trying to, build their capacity that way too. So I think that's a concern. So it's economic, like I said earlier, plus it's all military. You put the two together, and that's what makes us a strong force. So we have to be prepared for that. So nothing else. I yield back, and I think we're probably done.
I think the gentleman, given the lateness of the hour, we will be concluding. I want to thank the panel. I also just want to underscore a couple of closing points. We saw recently, in fact, with respect to the Solomon Islands, that they severed diplomatic relations with Taiwan, which is probably a pretty good example of how further isolating Taiwan diplomatically, and I think that serves as a pretty good example of how these issues get linked and how it becomes pretty impossible to resist other areas of Chinese influence internationally when you are so interwoven, and how dependent our participation in this competition is on the point Mr. Hillman made, which is that we assume a certain model of what we're dealing with, and I think you made this point as well, Ms. Walsh. And I thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for the bipartisan remarks today, because I want to close by pointing out that a lot of us feel that for 40 years, both parties have participated in a bipartisan way in a strategy towards China that is starting to show real limitations. Maybe it's not forever, maybe it's dependent on the current regime, but it's real. And I think we are beginning to see, in a robust bipartisan way, a reassessment on Capitol Hill, and that's gonna stretch across a lot of different areas of jurisdiction. and the whole of government certainly sums it up, but it's not just government, is it? It's also the American private sector. It's also the American not-for-profit sector. It's also our academic institutions. Those are all elements of the Chinese strategy, and we need to enroll those sectors in our strategy as well. We prefer to have them not under the control of the government, but the important role they play is evident when you see the way China is executing on its global strategy through all those areas and more. So with that, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank my colleagues, and I need to ask unanimous consent that a record of today's hearing remain open until such time as the witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may have been submitted to them in writing. Not sure there were any, but if there are. Further ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing without objection so ordered. If no other members have anything to add, then the subcommittee will stand adjourned. Thank you very much. Good hearing. Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. It is. You know, it's just, so I've been,